It's a poker game. These are the times where people are either gonna raise, they're gonna double down, or they might end up folding. Resilience is defined from a national sovereign point of view based on who holds the best cards.
The semiconductor industry was built on globalization. For decades, the industry optimized around one core principle: build wherever the ecosystem is best. That means you design one country, manufacture in another country, package it somewhere else, and then you ship globally around the world. That model created one of the most efficient innovation engine in human history. But in recent years, the conversation has started to change. Today, companies and countries alike are asking different questions. What happens when efficiency conflicts with resilience? What happens when supply chains become strategic? And what happens when interdependency becomes both a competitive advantage and a potential vulnerability? Because semiconductors are no longer viewed as purely commercial products. They are now deeply connected to AI, economic competitiveness, infrastructure, and national strategy, which means the industry is entering a new phase, one where strategic positionings, partnerships, and ecosystems resilience may matter just as much as technology leadership itself. So in this episode, we'll explore how supply chain interdependencies and strategic alliances are reshaping the semiconductor landscape. So, Salam, the semiconductor industry has historically optimized for efficiency and specialization. Do you think the industry is now entering an era where resilience becomes equally important?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. I think if you this is my shameless input that I'm going to put in here, Don. If you read my book, The Game of Chips, it's a poker game, right? These are the times where people are either gonna raise, they're gonna double down, or they might end up folding, right? And if you look at it from that type of standpoint of view, you will realize that resilience is defined from a national sovereign point of view based on who holds the best cards, right? And some countries, the countries that have the royal flush per se, the best of cards, and that basically covers all the areas, whether you talk about EDA, whether you talk about equipment, whether you talk about foundry, fab, design, at the end of the day, even end user, they'll have the best negotiation spots on a geopolitical standpoint of view, without a doubt, because that is the forte of semiconductor manufacturing. You mentioned that the semiconductor industry is often described as highly interdependent, right? I think this is without a doubt a perspective whereby any nation that wants to have strength on the negotiation table, if you have a solid semiconductor ecosystem, your negotiation perspective is much more powerful than someone who doesn't have an ecosystem in place. If we look at just look at what happened in the COVID time, right? Not that long time ago, right? Things went standstill at one point, right? That just shows you the immense requirement or the immense need for semiconductor manufacturing, no matter where it is. So this is fundamental, without a doubt.
And to that, we're alluding to self-sufficiency is a common term that comes up quite a lot. So do you think self-sufficiency in semiconductor is realistically achievable for any country or any region today?
Depends on how you frame it. I mean, Don, look, at the end of it, as a vulnerability, self-sufficiency in a lot of industry conversations that come into play, and it's very obvious for anybody to understand why. The last few years have been pretty instructive on the front. But I think that framing it in certain ways misses something important. And the truth is that self-sufficiency is also the source of enormous collective capability. No single country or company could produce a leading edge chip alone. The knowledge, like I said, the equipment, the materials, the talent are generally distributed across the globe, period. And that's not a bug in the system, Don. In many ways, it's what makes the system so capable. So the strategic question isn't how to eliminate interdependence. That's probably not achievable, and the cost of trying is ridiculous as well. So the real question is how to manage your exposure within it. You know, that means understanding which dependencies are acceptable, which represent critical risks, and where do you need either redundancy or deeper partnership to protect continuity. That is the strategic outlook that needs to be done.
As we talk about interdependency, the need to work together, and we'll also talk about the challenges, uncertainty right now. So as uncertainty increases globally, uh, how are semiconductor companies changing the way they think about investments, expansion, and ecosystem positioning? Do you see anything from there?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, the the last few years is just the best example one needs, Don. The last few years have been a masterclass in this tension. The semiconductor supply chain was, as you mentioned, optimized over decades for efficiency. What does that mean? Lean inventory, geographic concentration, even logistics, just-in-time delivery plays a massive role. And it worked beautiful in stable conditions. What one needs to consider the equation to that is that it generated real sustained cost advantages. What it couldn't survive at the end of the day was the stress associated. So if we consider what happened in what was it, 2020, early 2024, I think Q1 or Q2 2024, when an earthquake in Taiwan forced TSMC to halt production for up to 15 hours. 15 hours. And manufacturing a single advanced chip involves over 1,000 processing steps. And that's across a 70 to 90-day cycle. So, and then add on top of that, with specialized knowledge concentrated amongst fewer than 50,000 engineers globally, any disruption will mess up the game, period, though. So the recalibration happening now is essentially the industry repricing resilience. Companies are accepting higher costs, dual sourcing, buffer inventory, geographic diversification. We're seeing this happen. And this is in exchange, Don, for reduced exposure to single points of failure, right? If I look at it from a government standpoint, I mean, let's pick the US, for example, the CHIPS Act, $52 billion investment. Yeah. This was essentially a government level version of that same calculation. But the challenge is that resilience is expensive and its value is largely invisible until something goes wrong.
We dive a lot about resilience, and I like to take a different stab at it. So as we keep talking about resilience. We talk about it's interconnected. So you need partnerships and alliances. So and that's more
Right.
important than ever. And in your view, in what separates strategic partnerships that create long-term value from those that are merely transactional?
What you're seeing today is a genuine divergence in strategy. And anybody that's on the sideline, they're finding it fascinating to watch this in real time. So what you're seeing is that some companies are doubling down on specialization. They're becoming the absolute best in one layer of the value chain and then building an ecosystem leverage from that position. Others out there are pursuing selective vertical integration, particularly around capabilities they view as kind of strategically sensitive or where they've identified dependencies they need to own. And then, as I mentioned early on, is an area that we cannot take for granted, especially in this semiconductor world that we're in, Don, is that there's the geopolitical dimension. And this is genuinely new. So governments are, Don, at the end of the day, look, governments are essentially becoming active participants in the supply chain strategy. We can see this where you are right now in Singapore, for example, through incentives, for example. In the US, for example, export controls and industrial policy as well. I mean, I have to always pick up the big elephant in the room is TSMC, for instance. They've had to establish advanced fabs across 12 countries. And at the end of the day, they're absorbing significant cost and timeline pressures. And that's precisely because the geopolitical calculus has changed. So companies today have to factor all of that into the long horizon investment decisions that they do. And that's a genuinely a different kind of complexity from what the industry was navigating just 5 years ago, Don. Different world.
Yeah, different world today. The interesting thing would be because you interact with the executive leaders and that operates in so many different regions, different country, and we have specialized
Yep.
players that, like you just mentioned, TSMC opened up 12 fabs in different countries, different regions. So across all these regions, are you seeing different regions approaching resilience and strategic positioning differently? Because we do have the same players that try to do things in different regions. So, but are the different regions, the country players, the strategy, when they look at resilience, is that different?
This is a very great question, Don. I think every country has its that's wants some presence is definitely got this in their roadmap. What's interesting, and this is making me giggle a little bit, is the ones who messed up. So the ones who messed up in the semiconductor ecosystem and were too late in the game, they're all jumping on quantum computing or quantum. you know so the ones that mess up, the ones who have had the head start, for example, um have everything in place. If we pick up any of the countries, Taiwan, China, America, Europe, for example, they have their essence in place. In the Middle East, you're seeing a lot of design houses coming into this region because it's too capex heavy to build a fab at the end of the day. So it's a challenge on this side of the world, for example. Other countries around the world are trying to find the easiest entry point, which is for them will be the design perspective, right? So they're going into that side of things. From a fabrication ecosystem point of view, where we're talking about equipment, material, and the fabs, I think any country that hasn't had a fundamental presence in semiconductor manufacturing is too late for them to get in. So the ones that have this presence in place, it only makes sense to double down. It only makes sense to double down because the moat. I mean, I wouldn't say the moat is the wrong word to use in this, or wrong phrase, but the entry point is very pricey, right? And it's not only money at the end of the day, Don. It's also talent. To find the best talent, to get the right talent in place. I mean, this is decades of implementation in place. This is an educational front, an educational fortress that needs to be put into place, right? And from that fulfills the rest of the ecosystem to come after. So, from my perspective, any country that wants to get into the semiconductor ecosystem, they want to get into the manufacturing ecosystem side, and I'm referring to equipment, to fab side of things, too late in the game, way too late. So for them, it makes sense to focus on either design or from an end application point of view where they can use those chips in-house.
As we approach the end of episode 2, I have to ask this question. So we just talk about different regions are different. There's challenges, and then different countries have to figure out how to survive in each of these, play in different roles and different specialization. So, but the interdependence is still has to happen. So how can companies persevere collaboration and innovation while navigating a very or increasingly fragmented world today?
Trust partnership. This is the semiconductor community is just like the ecosystem itself is not a easy industry to break into, right? It is I call it the mafia, right? Only select people are allowed inside this community, and relationships matter. Relationships matter. This is a people's game, the semiconductor ecosystem, right? Why? I mean, look, for example, here in the GCC, they have enough cash, man, right? They have enough cash to make things happen, right? But semiconductors isn't a plug and play system. You need the right talent, and you need the talent that's been there, that has mastered for decades to be into play, right? I like to use the analogy of the engineer in the subfab, for example, right? There's a special person in there who has 30 years of experience, who can do a certain notch on a HVAC tool, for example. Nobody else can do that except for that person, because they're specialized in it. It's multiple years. He has a special tactic to do, right? I think from that standpoint of view, even if it's our industry is fragmented in different areas, as you mentioned, but the relationships are much more dearer, longer, and deeper, and they need to be solidified by regular meetups. That's why we're in the business. That's why we survive as a business at the end of the day, because that's what we push for. That's our mission, is to bring leaders to share ideas in a trusted network. And we build that trusted network over time. It's not something that happens over one meetup. It's a consistent meetup on a global basis. So without a doubt, it's one word. Well, one word with a hyphen in the middle: trust building.
I like that. I like that a lot. Trust is important, so the ecosystem can continue to work, especially in an interdependence world.
Correct.